Everyone. Welcome to episode 26 of Conversations with I Follow the Leader. I have Hasnain on today. I am so excited. We are going to be talking about why acknowledgement is not enough. Why acknowledgement is not enough. Welcome, Anise. How are you?
I am holding up okay. I think today is a case of the Wednesdays where we're navigating technology. We are navigating different structural and systemic inequities we're coming across. So doing okay. How about you?
Yeah, doing well. And I love starting the conversation off right with reality. How are you? Really important that we don't just say fine. Definitely, yeah. I think it's been, we're coming towards the end of March, which is hard to believe. So trying to wrap my head around Q1 of 2022 ending. And again, like you said, we have so much going on in the world. We have everything happening in Ukraine right now. We also have in the United States confirmation hearings for a new judge, and so there's just a lot going on. And so I'm so excited that we get to have this conversation, the conversations that many people want to have in the workplace but don't have the opportunity to. Great. So I will read the description so that those watching or listening know exactly what we're going to talk about today. And so, what does it look like to intentionally facilitate and invest in equitable and inclusive work environments beyond diversity and representation hiring goals? And so, over the next 25 minutes, Anise and I are going to discuss how systemic and structural inequities continue to show up in progression practices and promotion policies, workplace norms, and cultures. So excited. Anise is a DEI leader with I Follow the Leader and also partners with community-based organizations as a trainer and program specialist. She is amazing, facilitating workshop conversations and capacity building on safety defined by community rooted in consent. And so, want to welcome Anise. My pronouns are she, her. Anise's are she, they. And so, Anise, welcome, and just tell us a little more about yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation to be in this conversation, and for the very warm welcome and intro. I think something that remains very important to me within this work, and I think is helpful in folks getting to know me a little bit better, is I carry a lot of visible and invisible identities, or identities that are sort of prescribed onto me and identities that I ascribe to. So, for example, I am half white American through Irish, Scottish ancestry and descent. I am also half South Asian through South Asian and West Asian descent. So there's a lot of privileges that my lack of melanin or my light skin affords me, a lot of rooms that I've been able to enter into, but also a lot of assumptions made about what certain, stereotypes I might adhere to or also believe in about brown and Muslim people in particular. Same kind of goes across the board of identifying as queer and not being perceived as visibly queer or whatever that means. And then also holding disabilities and not being particularly obvious and upfront. So, I think, especially in terms of getting to know me, something that I really hold on to and have found across folks with mixed identities or with different visible and invisible identities is our experiences are really composed of these different layers. And starting to unpack and explore those, we start to get into the intersectionality of some of the inequities we'll be talking about in a little bit.
Thank you. And I just want to thank you for your vulnerability, because I think it's so important in this work to be willing to share that we are all do have these different intersections. We have these different demographics that may not all be obvious or visible. And so I know that so many people, including myself, can relate to that. And we try to talk a lot about what you may see or perceive, or the assumptions you may hold about someone could be completely false. And the identities that you may want to uplift for them, they may not even identify with. So I think that's so important. We had a focus group with someone who is from Jamaica yesterday, and she said, right, for me, race or being Black is probably the fifth thing I think about on my list of identities. And so important that we get to know people and allow them the inclusive space to actually share who they are. So I really just want to applaud you for being willing in this space to share more about yourself and your identities.
Thank you. And I appreciate what you bring up about how different identities of ours may be more relevant or more salient or more prominent, and others might not be, as top of mind. And I think it starts to uh, get to sort of which um, collective or which specific types of identities are really cast to the forefront, whether or not that person consents, right? So, like race and
Yes.
ethnicity, right, is usually one of the first identities that someone else might observe or assume or prescribe, and can really inform and influence assumptions, can really inform and influence expectations, can really inform and influence, like what others might assume is appropriate in how they treat that person. It might not be their core salient identity, but it's very real. And, like within progression and promotion, for example, um,
Yes.
there was a large tech corporation that I was working at for a period of time. And the number of stories I would hear about Asian women in sales and the types of assumptions that would be made about their leadership style or about their communication effectiveness or about their, quote unquote assertiveness was just horrifying. It both kind of casted and stereotyped them, and also did not hold space for any other version of sales leadership outside of what white men may practice. So, I appreciate you bringing up that piece around identity.
Yeah, and I think, right, I Follow the Leader is called I Follow the Leader because we wanted to challenge what a leader looks like traditionally, especially in the United States, which, like you said, is a white male type of leadership style. I watched a video yesterday and it talked about how some people are still doing the test of, would I want to go get a beer with this person? And that helps to determine cultural fit, right? So as we can
Yeah.
tell, right, that's not an inclusive practice. For those listening, really going, how do we go beyond, and we'll get into our conversation now more, but how do we go beyond, right, just bringing someone on for diversity, or the opposite, just bringing someone on for cultural fit, but that cultural fit really means, am I comfortable with this person? Would I want to hang out with them outside of work? And so this goes right into something we talked about when we spoke, was who is deemed as capable and competent and why. So do you want to just speak a little more on that kind of challenge to those who are in hiring, recruitment, retention, of who is deemed capable and why?
Yeah, and I really love that you bring up that video, because I think it's really important to name that the, beer test or the golf test or, the elevator test are still very real and applied, measurement tools that folks are using. It might not look like a specific question in an interview guide anymore at some places, but it doesn't change the reality of how we know these things play out in the coffee cooler or coffee room conversations, or in the pressure we might see from senior executives on recruiting teams to hire a specific referral. We see it come up in, who might be assigned which project, especially if it's a very popular project or one that will generate a lot of visibility within an organization or within a team, who's even assigned those things and then has the chance to show their lived experience and expertise, be evaluated on it and potentially promoted. And even promotions being ultimately still not equitable and folks being compensated accurately for their labor and for their contributions. So when we think about, who is seen as, capable, who is seen as contributing, there's some very clear lines around assumed identities that are still taking place today. Um, I think in the last couple of years, especially with the nationwide uprising that took place after George Floyd was murdered by police officers, there was a lot of performance. We saw kind of the meeting of internal pressure. So, folks who are DEI practitioners, folks who are just everyday employees, kind of pushing for more inclusivity, pushing for more equity. And then also this societal pressure from community organizers, from community members, from different places, leading to this moment of a few more companies taking a few more steps or claiming a few more layers to their DEI statements or commitments. And, frankly, I don't know if I've seen that play out in action at every organization with the same passion that folks want to put up that performance or do that value signaling. And it plays out. So we see how, oftentimes white folks will be assumed to be capable and competent, right? Their particular communication style, whatever that might be, is assumed to be the right style. Or the, leadership approach of white men that might be at times dominating or might be at times very hierarchical and not very collaborative is seen as like, that's totally okay. We see this along lines of gender, right? Where women, queer folks, femme folks, non-binary folks, trans folks might be perceived as less capable. We know that oftentimes they're less likely to be given that assignment that allows someone to showcase their skills. We know they're likely to be underpaid. We also know for trans folks, for example, they're likely to just not be hired to begin with or even have access to the relationships to get into the space, right? We know that around lines of ability, right? I hold a disability myself. I hold, like mental health things that I struggle with, but people wouldn't know that just perceiving me on site. Right. And so when I am having a bad mental health day, I have the privilege of having already been invited into the space or already been accepted into the space without my disability being visible. So we also see it across those lines. And I think, where we've seen some progress is a lot of companies, at least wanting for, diversity or representation, because it's something you're able to perform, right? They'll look around the people around them and think, hey, I noticed that this person's a different race and ethnicity. I noticed that person might practice a different religion that might have visible attire associated with it. I noticed that person, I'm perceiving them as disabled or perceiving them as queer or perceiving them as a woman. We've done our part, we have diversity. But too few folks are actually thinking about real inclusion and equity. So what that looks like is, one, the intersecting layers of these assumptions, the intersecting layers of these inequities. So, for example, there's a lot of conversation about pay inequities across a gender binary, right? Compared to men, women make less money per dollar, per hour, per, like labor being contributed. Compared to white men in particular, okay, there's a gap there. But where we need to get a lot more nuance and continue developing and expanding our understanding is that gap is even larger when you look at the gap between white men and women of color. That gap grows even further when we look at folks who might be in melanated femme or queer bodies that are also disabled. And this is where, oftentimes I see companies start shying away because it's too difficult, right? It's too difficult. It might push them outside of their comfort zone. It might feel like it's really hard to begin addressing. And, the reality is for some of these inequities, it took hundreds of years to very firmly establish them at every level. It's going to take intentionality to move forward in a direction that's truly inclusive and equitable. And it's going to take intentionality over time. And it's going to take discomfort. Like you and I were in a conversation yesterday where, the culture was described as a culture of nice. And we asked the question of, is it a culture of nice, or is it a culture of preserving the comfort of people who are experiencing overprivileging within the current environment?
Yeah, I mean, though you made so many good points. I'm taking notes for those who are watching. Yeah, I love just what you finished with, the intentionality over time, right? This is a journey, and even you referencing the history, right? The systems in place. It's going to take time to dismantle those, but really love the distinction between performative, right, performative displays and intention. And often that does come down to what you said, the equity and inclusion. So people are getting more, right, what they call diversity, which we really recommend defining diversity for your organization, making that available, not only for internal but external, because some people's definition of diversity, like you said, only goes so far, and many people are only thinking of race and gender. And so that is what diversity means. And so important that leaders are willing to actually define the organization's definition of diversity, so that those trying to enter the space can know, is this a place where I actually will have equitable opportunities and where my voice can be heard? So important, right? You can be at the table. I don't know if you saw the award show that Serena and Venus were recently at, right? They were at the table, but you had a woman, a director, who won and said, but you didn't have to fight against the guys. So you may be champions, but you didn't go up against men. And it's like, we have to stop doing that. Just because we can't relate to other people's identities, we shouldn't be ranking ourselves above someone else in an underrepresented group. And I think that often happens. And like you said, going back to who is able to showcase their skills, who's able to get different opportunities, is just so important. And so I would love to know from you. I know we both agree that a lot has been performative. And so if you can talk a little more about what's causing organizations to stumble, what are some of the things that they can look at to realize, wow, am I just doing performative work, or am I really pushing the pace of progress?
Yeah. So I think, oftentimes when organizations take their first few steps in, any sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion change work, it's oftentimes under-resourced, to be very honest with you. It's bananas to me that, some of these business leaders can understand how much resourcing is needed for every department of their organization, but do not seem to grasp that asking your employees to do additional work to develop the culture for the company you own and you steward and you likely make the most salary from is ridiculous, right? You are asking them to now take on additional labor that is going to likely like seep beyond the number of hours you are actually paying them for, whether that's an hourly wage or a salaried wage. So we really see that under resourcing take place. We also see where oftentimes these organizations will start with, their entry points of understanding of things like white supremacy systems, things like intersectionality. And what that looks like is in hiring programs, assuming that gender diversity only includes cisgendered men and cisgendered women, right? Or people who identify as the gender that they were marked with at birth, right? We see from the lines of race and ethnicity, folks have developed kind of collectively an increased awareness of anti-Blackness. And so they'll focus on, what are we doing to account for systemic anti-Blackness and really root that out of our organization. And then very much stumble when it extends into, really thinking about how can we relationship build and develop equitable places and spaces for our Indigenous community members, for our Asian community members, right? Starting to think a little bit more expansively for our Latina community members. And so they get really stuck and rooted in these binaries. And I've seen this show up in a white and Black binary, and a man and woman binary, in a abled and disabled binary that's usually defined by disabilities people feel like they can perceive or seem visible, and it also shows up in this very good and bad binary, right, where good is rewards, it's the gold stars that vice presidents and very large corporations will either give themselves or accept from other people in their Twitter feeds for announcing yet another diversity and inclusion week, while sidestepping away from actually changing systems and structures where they have a lot of influence and opportunity to do so. It looks like a lot of white leaders in particular being afraid of getting it wrong, or just going straight to punishment for folks who might have misstepped. And it really conflates accountability with punishment, and they're very different things, right? So accountability might look like acknowledging the harmful behavior, but identifying what support is needed for that behavior to change. So I think those are some of the core stumbling blocks very early on that I see. And you just see this build and build and build and build as you start looking at progression and promotion and those policies and those experiences within organizations. And as you start looking at culture, there was a smaller tech company that I worked with over the past couple of years, and developed a really great relationship with my point of contact over there. I have so much love for them. This person was in a white masculine body, was a people manager. And, by the end of us working together, they realized that they had taken some steps to develop an inclusive team and to make sure that Black women in particular on their team had support. But despite that, they were just, seeing those folks leave the organization and move on to other companies. And they were having a hard time piecing it together. And there was one day where it really clicked for them, and they really understood, I have been asking these folks to adhere to a very white, American culture and those expectations and those norms, while not doing my part of equity to create the space for different lived experiences, for different expertises, for different cultures, for different, communication approaches to coexist and be uplifted. And so, let's go back to hiring and retention, right? Because that's been, at least in my observations, has been a hot topic across organizations over the past 5 to 7 years, right? Where oftentimes that's where it starts. They start with an under-resourced recruiting team where individual recruiters are tasked with miraculously convincing their hiring managers to practice anti-racism, to practice gender inclusion, to practice their ongoing learning and unlearning, which, unless those individual recruiters are extremely well versed, doesn't go well. There's oftentimes a power dynamic there where your people operations team might not have the same weight within the organization as your sales or engineering or operations or other business teams. There's usually a power dynamic across identity where a lot of recruiting teams might be composed of women and femme folks, and we might see across people managers, they're predominantly men or masculine. And so there's all this burdening, all this weight. So, let's say you have this recruiter named Mackenzie. She's been actively making sure that she continues to learn and studying best practices and advocating for them to be, the standard. This is how we are going to operate here. She's, made it through the difficult conversations with the hiring managers to take, candidates seriously that are considered quote unquote diversity candidates because they're not white men. She's made it through all those steps. Then she makes it to compensation and the offer letter. And the compensation coming back might very well likely, and usually does, reflect that compensation gap we see societally and at large. When we look along the lines of identity, we see huge disparities, right? So now, you're having someone on board who, let's say is, like an Asian woman, less likely to be accurately compensated for her worth. If she's stepping into an organization where even her talent being considered was a fight, what type of culture is she stepping into? Right. So now
Yeah.
we're talking about the type of space that you're in and what you might be experiencing there, whether it's explicit or implicit.
No, that's so important, because I think it's so important. It's not just getting people in the door. It's, will they feel a sense of belonging to actually bring their whole self, right? Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something, I feel like DEI really was the hot topic in 2020 to 2021. And now it really is wellness. And I need people to understand, right? They're one and the same, they're connected.
Mm-hmm.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion, and wellness, and psychological safety, which you talked about, creating those safe spaces. Those are all connected. They're all intertwined. And so people are now looking at their great resignation and saying, okay, well, if we help with people's mental health, things are going to change, right? It's not just one component. Wellness is psychological safety, being paid right, what you're worth, not finding out that your coworker who may not have the same experiences making more. And so important that we are not just focusing on getting people in the door, but are we showing salary ranges? Are we posting starting salaries? Are we, and I follow the leader, we use scorecards, right? We use scorecards to evaluate candidates, and then we use point systems for pay. Right. So I could show, okay, this is why this is the level that you're at. It is based on these things. And I had a conversation this morning. We were talking about transferable skills, right? So it's not only just our point system isn't just degree, right? It is related to the job descriptions and transferable skills, because you may not have all of the direct degree, etc., but you may have transferable skills. And so our organizations paying people for those transferable skills, and not saying you don't have a PhD or you don't have a master's, so that's why you're not paid this, right? Really, can you look at the skill level? And I think a lot of people are going wrong in their hiring practices, like you said, under resourcing, expecting others to do additional labor that they're not skilled in.
Yeah. And it creates a leaky bucket phenomenon, right? Because I've seen organizations performatively invest in talent acquisition efforts. And because they are not really centering equity or inclusion, they're centering diversity and representation, kind of analogous to when colleges and universities find, the three Black students on their campus, and those are the folks who are photographed for the brochure. It's a virtue signaling, potentially. It's potentially value signaling, but it's not real relationship building work, and it's not really addressing the existing and ongoing harm that needs to be both acknowledged and addressed to achieve that wellness, to achieve that safety, to achieve that shift. And even with all of that, it is very understandable when folks who experience so much violence in, companies and organizations still decide I don't want to participate in the system at all if I can afford not to. And that's also a reality that people need to, hold space for and make sure that, they're understanding of, because it is understandable, and I think, it creates this leaky bucket, right? So you invest all these performative efforts into hiring folks who you perceive to be visibly diverse, whatever your definition of diversity is, right? Diversity is just difference amongst each other. But so oftentimes the word diversity is weaponized against candidates who are melanated, weaponized against candidates who are femme, weaponized against candidates who are queer or disabled, of some sort of weird like marker of this is the reason why you were hired, in a very pejorative way. And maybe there's a space in which folks are, you know, using that label, and what they intend is we value your lived experiences and expertise and see that as a benefit to our efforts. But that's not playing out when we then get to culture, and then when we get to progression and promotion, and when we get to equitable pay. There is a mental wellness group that services a lot of other organizations and offers some really incredible resources, especially given the last few years of an ongoing pandemic and how much of a load that's added to people's plates on top of everything else, right? And what was wild to me was the way that they chose to treat myself and a Black Nigerian American woman that I was collaborating with behind closed doors was bananas. And that is what that everyday practice looks like. And so, for this leaky bucket, you can hire anyone you want to your organization. You are going to see high attrition rates, and you're going to see, low rates of feeling or experiencing or even perceiving inclusion if you are not addressing everything that happens next. And the ask that I would make for organization leaders who are oftentimes holding the purse strings of resources is, if you are not practicing active listening, you're not going to get anywhere. My partner, I absolutely adore him. He works at a PR firm, and it's interesting to me because the CEO of that company was more willing to spend $10,000 on an Italian marble imported desk than to compensate the operations and facility workers. We have been living through an ongoing pandemic, an ongoing virus pandemic. Those are the folks who have been making sure that we can show up to work safely, that we understand, what updated information or recommendations are being shared, that we have working fire extinguishers on the off and very unfortunate chance that, there is a fire or that type of support is needed. And this is someone who is in a leadership role, who is, performing leadership as defined by whiteness, as defined by masculinity and the privileges that affords. There are a number of people within that organization who have brilliant ideas of what would address the pain that they are currently experiencing within that organization. They have been more than willing to name them. What there hasn't been is active listening. What there hasn't been is really taking those initiatives and putting resources into them. And it's funny because so many times in my experience as a DEI practitioner, as a DEI consultant, both in-house in organizations and as a consultant people hire, it's oftentimes a lot of facilitation. It's oftentimes a lot of adding my weight and my voice and my solidarity to folks who are living through the inequities at an organization, and trying to get resources to apply the solutions they have already named would work. And so these oftentimes these leadership teams will hire an external consultant to come in, and sometimes the most powerful thing that I find myself doing is having those hard conversations with those leaders, or facilitating the uplifting of what those folks are saying. So it's, there's those pieces around, like, you're going to see high rates of attrition if you're not truly committing to this through and through. And it shows up in so many ways, right? It shows up in the very visible, what feels tangible recruiting ways. If we have a quantitative headcount, we have like a known number of, in recruiting, we used to call it butts and seats that need to happen. We have, like, we know the teams, we know the stakeholders, all the way through things that might feel less visible, like progression policies. And the scenario or the example of that white man who it finally clicked for them was like, oh my God, I've been asking the Black women on my team to try and fit into this culture without even pausing to think about how can we add to the culture, how can we hold space for multiple experiences of a multifaceted culture, all the way through, when I worked at that big tech corporation that a lot of other places look to as a practitioner of good practices or as the gold standard. Like, embedded in the language of how we were evaluated, it excluded so many of us, and excluded so many of us being, truly seen for everything we were contributing. And like, it's interesting because there's finally some catching up, and there's now some like lawsuits being levied against that company of, hey, like, we finally collected enough stories, we finally built enough relationships across folks experiencing this. We are showing you this is a very, very big problem, we are demanding it be addressed. And these are the same internal demands that were presented time and time and time again to folks who held the purse strings, and if they were practicing and developing their active listening skills, might have been able to avoid that severe consequence, and might have actually started doing the intentional work over time to shift from deeply rooted inequities to a more equitable environment for every person in their organization.
It's so powerful and just so important for leaders to hear, that even if you don't understand DI, et cetera, right, there are going to be major consequences for not looking at the DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion in your workplace. And again, we're really focusing on equity and inclusion and expanding the definition of diversity and their wellness and belonging. And so important to look at that. Anise, this has been so amazing to have you on. I want to see if you have any closing thoughts. If you were to summarize what a leader can do next, what would you tell them to do if they want to truly improve in this arena?
Yeah, I mean, I would really end with reinstating that acknowledgement is not enough, right? That acknowledgement, that awareness is not enough. It's quite frankly never been enough, but now there's a lot of pressure within organizations and externally as well that is saying again and again, we are no longer going to settle for acknowledgement. Acknowledgement indicates that you have awareness. And my question would be, what are you doing with that awareness to apply it? Right? What are you doing to move beyond hearing of, this inequity over there? Right? We talk about, there's some very horrific violence taking place within Ukraine right now. I will be the first to say that some of that violence we're seeing from Russian police officers towards folks protesting against the war, some of the violence we're seeing in Black and brown Ukrainians not being able to leave Ukraine and also being denied entry by other countries exists right here in the US. And versions of that violence and what sits underneath it takes place in your companies. And you have a huge amount of influence and agency to do something about it. Right? Acknowledgement is not enough. And I would challenge organization leaders to move into actively listening to what people are asking of you and what they're requesting as solutions to pain they're experiencing, and to do it, to do something about it and to do it. Will it be uncomfortable? Probably yes. Might it include not spending $10,000 on an Italian marble desk that you don't really need and redistributing those funds to other folks? Yes. Could it include rethinking how you're salarying your own position and thinking about what does your salary look like relative to those that you are paying the lowest, and what does that say about how you value their contributions, and what does that say about you when you're thinking of how you perceive the value of those contributions? Like, take these tangible steps and actions, right? Revisit your progression and promotion policies because those are so tied to compensation, right? Revisit them, look at the language. Don't revisit them on your own, right? Invite in feedback, but truly do something with it. That would be my call to action because, like, you like very frankly speaking, you can hire myself, you can hire my friends, you can hire, I follow the leader as your consultant, and we bring a lot of value to the table, and we will tell you these hard truths as well.
Thank you so much, Anise. This was so great. Every leader needs to listen to this conversation. We have these courageous conversations that people are often scared to have because we believe these conversations should be commonplace. So we're going to move them from courageous to commonplace. And this was a really great one that every leader should listen to. So thank you so much for being here today, sharing your experience, sharing what you've seen. Really great, tangible. You gave us really great, tangible stories and evidence. So thank you.
Yeah, and I want to extend a thank you to yourself and also Adriana Fenya for coordinating all of this. I just want to uplift the folks who are working behind the scenes as well. So also including Thomas Mosley to bring these conversations to light, to bring these together, because for us as well, it's a team effort to co-create this space. So I would also like to say a huge thank you to those folks doing the back end work.
Thank you so much, Anise. Thank you. That was such an amazing conversation. And thank you for those in the comments. Really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks so much for sharing your knowledge. So glad you're part of the IFL team. Also love this comment. No more platitudes. Do the work. Thanks. Completely agree. So if you are wanting to have some of those tidbits, I like to take notes. So I'm going to give you some final highlights from what Anise shared. So acknowledgement is not enough. How can you move from performance to action, tangible action? And really that's going to take proactively listening. So listening to people intentionally. Also, you have to ask the question I wrote down, right? So if you don't ask people to share their experiences, they often won't feel comfortable doing so. And then how can we focus less on diversity and representation, but really move to also including equity and inclusion in the conversation? And then a lot of people are often left out of the conversation of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So can we expand our definition past race and gender? So we're also looking at other factors such as disability and ability, and also those who you may not look at, like Anise shared, and know what is different about them. And so important to allow people to bring their full selves to work, and then making sure that those who are underrepresented have a voice, but also are a resource. So thank you so much, Anise. Really, really important. Definitely, this is one you may need to listen back to a few times to really take notes. I know I have pages of notes myself. So thank you for showing us more about what change work requires and why acknowledgement is not enough. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Our next conversation is going to be on March 30th, and that will be Can We Talk Inclusion? So a great follow-up We talked about the need in this conversation to talk more about equity and inclusion. And we will have Lucky Daniels on. She's a certified diversity professional with an extensive background. And we've talked about some of the same things Anise and I have. So how can we continue to push the pace of progress? And remember that courage, I believe, is a choice. And so we have a choice if we're going to engage in these conversations, if we're going to push the pace of progress, or if we're going to go along with the status quo of what a leader has traditionally looked like. And as you have seen today, if you're watching, Anise and I may not look like a leader you've experienced before, but we are both DEI leaders with the firm, and we are here to really help all people progress forward. So thank you so much. We will talk to you again soon. This was episode 26 of Conversations with I